10 days from now, the US economy could sink. That is, if the US government fails to raise its $31.4 trillion debt ceiling by 1st of June. US President Joe Biden spoke to White House Speaker Kevin McCarthy in a crucial one-to-one meeting on Monday to address the pressing issue to avoid a debt default, but there was no deal at the end of it. The White House meeting came after Biden returned from his trip to Asia early to cut out a deal ahead of the US Treasury's June 1st cutoff date for the Congress to authorize more borrowing. Now remember, debt limits are raised periodically to cover existing approved loans, but House Republicans are now demanding significant spending cuts to address the nation's substantial $31.8 trillion debt as a condition for averting a default, and therefore the deadlock continues. Joining me at this point in time is markets commentator Srinath Sridharan. Also with us is Ishita Mukherjee, who is a professor at University of Calcutta. With me in the studio is my colleague Kartik Malhotra. Appreciate you all taking time out. Ishita, I want to begin by asking, what exactly is a debt ceiling and why is it significant?
Actually, this is different from countries like India, where we have a percentage fiscal deficit as the ceiling. So we have a percentage of GDP as the ceiling. But in United States, it's in terms of quantitative terms. So as this is in quantitative terms, so the maximum amount of debt, maximum quantity of debt is the ceiling. And as this is the maximum quantity of debt is the ceiling, and US increased the ceiling to 78 times more than that. In fact, we need to increase the quantitative terms. But this time, this has been very serious. As this is serious because this is going to affect the economy to a large extent, because US will not be able to pay the dues, and US will not be able to finance the US development.
Okay.
So it will fail. There will be a failure on part of the US government. So as far as it is being told, as far as the US debt crisis, that's why this is becoming a grave crisis. This is post-COVID and within a period of depression in the economy, in the global rate, and also post-2007-8 financial crisis. So the earlier days, it was a little different time, but this time, this is grave, and this is actually very grave this time, that US will not be able to fund.
All right. Kartik, very grave. US has reached a ceiling, the maximum ceiling to which it could, take on more debt. It's crucial, it's impending, but there is a deadlock here.
Yeah, so like Professor Mukherjee was mentioning, Shweta, in India we have the debt to GDP ratio, which is, so they are correlated, they are proportionately balanced. In the US, there's a numeric value given to the threshold of how much the Congress permits the US Treasury to borrow from the markets or from international partners. But I think the deadlock emerges primarily on account of the fact that the Congress, backed by the Republicans, is asking the Joe Biden administration to cut down on spending. So they are saying, give us a roadmap for the next 10 years. How are you going to cut spending? And this spending is actually, if you look at it, essential spending. So I was reading in the Wall Street Journal, and they've given a fairly interesting account, of how much is the debt in the overall contribution of the US economy's pie. So for every $4 that the US economy spends, $1 is leveraged. So $1 comes from debt. Now the point being, every economy is leveraged. Every organization broadly is leveraged. So why do you leverage? Why do you induct debt in your books? You induct debt because you want to grow faster than what your means permit you to. It's pretty much like you and me. We want to buy a car or we want to buy a house. We can't afford it up front, but we know it is important for us. We take a loan and that loan is sometimes more bloated than what our pockets can afford, but then it's imperative to take that loan to continue growing. That's the case with corporations as well. You don't have enough liquid cash, but you know that you are building assets and you're building something that is going to give you returns later. So on account of that growth, you take debt on your books. That's what countries do as well. That's what India also does. Every country does. But specifically in the US, they have a fairly strong social sector with the social security, with free education, with their military expenses, with their healthcare expenses. And remember, this is also a more aging population than India. And with the overall social security and these free sort of socialist schemes that US continues to, to harbor and invest in, these become critical expenses that the US government has to bear. Now, the X date, as it is referred to, X like the numeric X date, the X date is 1st of June 2023. On 1st of June, if the debt ceiling is not raised and if the Treasury, which is equivalent to their Ministry of Finance, is not allowed by the Congress to borrow more money, it doesn't have enough money in its pockets to meet its obligations on all these accounts.
Okay.
Now, in addition to this, you have the treasury bills, which are equivalent to the G-Secs, government securities in our case, the bonds, and you have investments that are going to mature. This is already money which is lying with the government. The yield on that or the return has to be given back to people who have invested in those securities. And of course, the overall military spends, education, healthcare, social security, all these are fundamental bills which have to be paid by the US government, which unless it is unable to borrow, on 1st of June, that X date, the doomsday sort of gets met, and the US doesn't have money to honor those bills, and hence the possibility of default, which has never happened in the US because
Absolutely.
US is the safest haven. US Treasury has never defaulted. You have never had a situation that a bill in the US government has not been honored. So it is a big deal. It is definitely a big deal, and it happened last in 2011, if memory serves me right. But again, a consensus was arrived at just in time, a couple of days before the X date was arrived at, and there are talks that this time around also in the nick of time we will arrive at a situation that Congress gives the go ahead to the Treasury to raise the ceiling on debt. But what Janet Yellen is also saying is interesting. She's saying it's an archaic concept.
There should not be any
It's an
ceiling.
archaic, you don't need a ceiling. You borrow as much as is required, as much as you want to leverage yourself to continue growing at the pace you want to grow at.
Absolutely. Let's bring in Srinath at this point in
great.
time.
Srinath
Srinath
is
is
here.
joining us. Srinath, what do you make of Janet Yellen's statement that you should be allowed to borrow as much as you like? Would that be a fair concept? And I understand, a default is very unlikely. Similar situations have, and there's precedent. So similar situation has arrived or has happened earlier as well in the US back in 2011, where they came very close to defaulting, but it didn't come through. This is more political than economic. But if US were to default, what exactly are we looking at?
Yeah, I think just like most of the Hollywood movies, I think this is a pot boiler where we know the outcome. I'm betting on US won't default, it can't default, and I'll address why I'm saying so. But the plot in which they narrate makes it for interesting to say US is great. It's the greatest democracy. Of how all the stakeholders came together to save the world. I think they will score more political brownie points with this entire aspect. So the hero will never die in an Indian movie, very, very similar. But what we are forgetting is it is almost like, since the IPL season is on, imagine IPL changing rules every day to suit the star player. US is doing exactly that. It has almost every 5 to 6 years changed its debt.
Okay. I think we
The rules suited.
Sorry, Srinath. Yes, please.
So the rules can't keep changing, and that's something I think coming back to the question about Janet Yellen's speech. I think it's absurd. You can't keep shifting the goalpost. How do then rating agencies, especially do sovereign rating? They want to ensure that US will remain the dollar will remain as a reserve currency, and their rating will be spectacular rating as well. What we don't forget is, if you look at the top 10 holders, sovereign holders, including Japan and China who hold T-bills, I think it's to the tune of nearly $8 trillion of US Treasury bills. It's a substantial number, which is Just to give a perspective, last year alone, the US government spent nearly $400 billion on interest payments. So if you're talking about the top 10 nations holding there, it's 20x the interest payment. So you can't have, and it's the usual banking problem, right? If somebody has borrowed 100 rupees, is not bothered. But if somebody has borrowed 100 crores, the bank is bothered. It's the same thing. More number of debt that keeps increasing for the US, it's troublesome for the world. And more importantly, where is the moral gumption for the nation that nominates the president of World Bank? I mean, if you default, what right do you have to say that I'm going to set rules for institutional funding and sovereign funding growth? I mean, a lot of those geopolitical issues are also there.
All right. It appears we have lost Srinath, but essentially I think what he's saying is you cannot keep changing the goalpost and you cannot keep borrowing as much as you like because that will act against market forces.
But I think somewhere the treasury is going to balance that.
Okay.
Right. You need to, so see, US is also in a situation right now that we've been noticing that step up on the Fed rates, on interest rates. They've been hiking every month practically. Inflation is high. So US does need the money, right? And you can suck out only this much liquidity from the market, but then there is interest to be paid on that as well, which banks by way of lending to institutions can mark up and the delta sort of offsets. But broadly speaking, you definitely need money to grow, right? And the US is cognizant of the fact that it does need some leverage to grow, and there are impending bills that need to be honored. But what Srinath was referring to again was this fact of the ratings actually getting cut, and this also happened in 2011. In 2011, I think it was Fitch or one of these rating agencies which had cut down the AAA rating of US Treasury bills, and that in turn sort of entails that the credit offtake that the US does is at a higher rate than what it otherwise gets with a better rating. So the ratings definitely come in. That becomes one critical function. But in addition to that, yeah, obviously you have more critical everyday expenses which will have to be prioritized, which will have to be honored first. And I think growth comes later. Sustenance will have to take precedence, and sustenance activities will have to be honored, for which I think the US should have some money. If it doesn't have money for that, then it's definitely a problem.
Absolutely. It is a problem. And let me get in Ishita at this point in time. Ishita, we understand that it is a big issue to the point where Joe Biden had to cancel Quad's meeting, go back to the US. He's currently in process of getting more and more people on board, talking to as many people as possible, including the White House Speaker. But the deadlock continues. We don't know how long it will continue. We understand from what has happened in the past that there will be a resolution. But coming back to the question of what happens in case there is no resolution, are we looking at US defaulting, and what does that mean?
Now, I don't think no resolution will be there. I see a resolution will be there. It's never happened. But if we have a no resolution, that would mean a serious crisis in the global capitalist system. It's already crisis, and it will have effect on the European countries, and it will have a tremendous trade effect in all the other countries with whom the US is having the trade ties. It will have its spillover effects in the global market. With US defaulting, this would mean that, like the other crises, when the crisis is mostly it was dissipated throughout the world. But if there is a default, the anxiety that we have at this moment is that it will be dissipated throughout the world. And already the post-COVID, the V-shaped recovery is not to be seen in many parts of the world. Many of the countries are suffering. We are already suffering from inflation. Inflation is being talked about, but what is not being talked about is the unemployment and hunger.
Okay, we will take some time, Ishita, we will of course take some time out and talk about unemployment and hunger. Those are important issues, but keeping our focus on the US debt ceiling, we understand that deadlock continues. We'll keep tracking all the details emerging from that story.